Okay, good evening, everyone. Sorry to everybody on the webinar, just trying to get this working. Okay. Okay, I want to begin by, of course, thanking our sponsors. By once again thanking our series sponsors, Jennifer David Miller, commemorating the upcoming yard site of Rachel Shoretz, Allah Shalom. And tonight's shir is co-sponsored by Stephanie and Michael Kaufman in memory of Michael's beloved father, Barry Kaufman, Yitzchak Isaac with Bibles, Zechron L'Bracha, Neshama Shep and Aliyah, and by Hedy and Jay Richmond, commemorating the yard site of Rabbi Chaim Feigenbaum, Allah Shalom, whose neshama should have an Aliyah. And the learning we do tonight should be a merit for all their neshamas. Now, by way of introduction, I entitled tonight's shir "Selfless Service, or Are There Limits?" And I will note the following irony before we begin tonight. We spent last week outlining the basic details of the mitzvah of Kibbud Av V'Em, its illustrious status, the fact that it is a linchpin mitzvah in many ways. It is the bridge of what I call the axis of the Aseret HaDibrot. It links Bein Adam HaMakom and Bein Adam HaChavero. It is the mitzvah that gives us a paradigm for how we relate to Hashem himself. The Mishnah and the Gemara Masechtas Kiddushin quite overtly and explicitly relate Kibbud Av V'Em to our relationship with Hashem, to Kavod HaMakom. So on the one hand, it is this rather very core, critical mitzvah. And yet we're actually going to spend this week and next week talking about some of the difficulties pertaining to this mitzvah. We're going to talk about areas of tension as it pertains to the mitzvah of Kibbud Av V'Em. And that is by design. The irony notwithstanding, I think there's a reason why we're going to spend 2 weeks talking about different tension areas when it comes to Kibbud Av V'Em. For one, that's often where these shilas come up. When it's easy to do any mitzvah, when it's easy to do Kibbud Av V'Em included, then there isn't a whole abundance of questions or shilas or tensions to address. Then it's easy. And Baruch Hashem, there are many instances in which we are able to honor our parents and serve them in ways that are not challenging. And yet there are often areas where it is challenging. It is a difficult mitzvah to do in instances. And it's often precisely in those tension areas that questions do arise. I would point out that number two, it is precisely in those areas of tension when we most need to remember our Kibbud Av V'Em obligations. It is precisely in the moments, and this is an argument that I'll make as we go forward, it's precisely in the moments of tension where we're cognizant of what Kibbud Av V'Em does not demand, that we need to be more acute in reminding ourselves of what it does. In an instance in which I'm serving my parents, and again, just to use the paradigmatic examples given in the Gemara, I'm bringing them food and drink and serving them in the traditional sense. It's certainly good to be mindful that you're performing a mitzvah, but if it's not front of mind, you're still doing the mitzvah. In areas of tension, you need to be very, very acutely aware of the demands of Kibbud Av V'Em and its limits, but you need to always bear in mind what Kibbud Av V'Em does demand precisely in those moments when it's a little more difficult. And three, I'm going to argue that the areas of tension, the ones that we'll explore this week and next week, they really do serve to highlight Kibbud Av V'Em. You could call it a Kibbud Av V'Em stress test. That sometimes it is precisely when a mitzvah is under duress that you get the best understanding and appreciation of what the mitzvah is more broadly. And obviously our hope is to perform the mitzvah of Kibbud Av V'Em without stress and tension and difficulty. But understanding how it operates under those circumstances can give us a better understanding of Kibbud Av V'Em during the tranquil moments when that stress and tension doesn't exist. In particular, this week and next week, we're going to talk about two forms of tension. This week, we're going to talk about religious tension. We're really going to, in a certain sense, pick up right where we left off last week with the idea of kulchem chayavin bechvodi, cases where there's tension between mitzvah X and Kibbud Av V'Em. And what exactly do we do in those circumstances? We spoke about it in the abstract last week. We're going to talk about more practical applications this week. And then next week, our final topic is what I call the sandwich generation. When one is in the middle of the sandwich, when you're caring for adult children and caring for elderly parents, in theory, one should be both receiving at that point Kibbud Av V'Em and giving Kibbud Av V'Em. That could present unique challenges, and it's one that I think many of the members of our Kehillah have expressed to me at different points. So we'll talk about the tensions that arise in those circumstances, both in navigating Kibbud Av V'Em as a parent towards your adult children, and navigating Kibbud Av V'Em when Kibbud Av V'Em requires difficult conversations and truths towards aging parents that also present unique challenges. Trying to do what you feel is best for your parents when they don't necessarily feel the same way. How do you navigate those kinds of situations, and what are the demands of Kibbud Avim then? So that will be our discussion next week. But this week, we're going to talk about, again, religious tension in the context of Kibbud Avim. Let me offer a few prefatory notes before we jump into our sources. A little while back, and I've spoken about this on a few occasions, not, I don't think, here in B'nai Yeshurun. I spoke about this in Stern College pretty recently. But a little while back, I was on a panel for the OU. The OU brought together a group of rabbinic leaders and educators, and the topic of the OU panel was misalignment. What is misalignment? What do we do in areas and scenarios where, let's use a school setting for simplicity's sake, when in a school setting you have a set of values X, and the parent body does not necessarily have that same set of values. Let's say, again, talk in abstract and theory. Let's say you're teaching in a school where many of the children don't come from Shomer Shabbos homes. And you're teaching in an Orthodox school, so you are teaching the values of Shmir Shabbos. Perhaps you even have a halacha class where you're going through the halachos of Hilchos Shabbos, but you're doing so knowing that many of the students, many of the children are not coming from homes that share the same values, or even if they share the same values in abstract, are not observing the same values that you are preaching in the classroom. And it was a whole conference on how to navigate misalignment. Most of the people in the room were older than me. They were all wiser than me. I think I was the second youngest person in the room, and I really didn't speak up too much. I did a lot of listening, but I can tell you that my fundamental approach on the issue was somewhat different from almost everyone in the room. I think most of the discussion surrounded how to bridge the gap of misalignment. When you have misalignment, how exactly do you bridge it? How do you make the gap narrower? That was most of the conversation. From my standpoint, that's certainly a valuable conversation to have, but it is not always the most feasible thing to do. And from my standpoint, it is certainly not the most important thing to do when it comes to misalignment. What is the most important thing? That's what I'd like to develop over the course of this year. I'll make one second prefatory note before we jump into the sources, that another inspiration for this is my brother. My brother is a Rabbi in Yeshivat Aseret in Eretz Israel, and he was recently interviewed on a podcast. I know that some of you listened to that podcast because many of you reached out to me to tell me that you did so. He was recently interviewed on a podcast called Shana B'Iyun. It's a podcast about the year in Israel. It's called Shana B'Iyun. I confess I hadn't heard of it until my brother was on it. But he was recently interviewed, and he was interviewed precisely on this question of misalignment, with a very particular manifestation of it. He was interviewed on the question of why so many of our kids go to Israel and they come back Haredi and they don't have the same values that we raise them with within our modern Orthodox, OU, YU, RCA, whatever phrase you want to use, within our centrist communities. And there's a lot to that question. There's a lot to that question. It's not going to be our focus tonight. Another time, we could have a full discussion just on that question. But certainly elements of it will overlap with our discussion tonight. My brother focused on one particular component of the issue. My thoughts and his quite naturally heavily overlap on this issue. My brother and I are very close. And again, there's really a lot to talk about on that question, more broadly, of misalignment vis-a-vis the year in Israel and the values that kids go in with and that they come out with. There's a lot of facets to that. But I want to throw that out as a framework also, because certainly some of the questions that we are going to discuss are going to relate quite directly to that broader question as well. So let's take a look at what some of the sources have to tell us about these cases of religious misalignment. And then after assessing some of the halachic sources, we're going to try to zoom out and try to come to some conclusions regarding how we can navigate it as parents and how we can navigate it as children, or how we can hope that children will navigate it. Certainly when I speak to high school students or college students, it's more from the angle of the children. Now we're going to focus more from the angle of parents, but I think they really do very much go hand in hand and are two sides of the same coin. So let's just begin with an assessment of the halachic sources. Source number one is a Gemara that we saw last week. Source number one says, Ashkechan de asi aseh v'dachi lo sa'aseh greda, lo sa'aseh sheyish b'kares hecha ashkechan de dachi, sa'chladai tachamina teisi mikibud abeim. The Gemara says, again, if you recall, we were talking about this whole principle called aseh docha lo sa'aseh, that when you have tension or triage between a mitzvah aseh and a mitzvah lo sa'aseh, ordinarily speaking, the mitzvah saseh trumps the lo saseh. The mitzvah saseh is given priority. And the Gemara says maybe that should even be true if the lav is so severe that it has a chiyuv kares. Why would I think so? Because of kibbud aveim. The Sanya, and here we come to the critical line for us, the bold of source number 1. Yachol yehei kibbud aveim docha Shabbos. Perhaps if a parent told me, violate Shabbos, go cook a piece of meat, go plow the earth, go plant seeds, whatever the case may be, whatever the malacha is, I should do so. Talmud lomar ish imo ve'aviv tiro v'yashav sosai tishmoru kulchem chayavin bechvodi. The Torah, in a number of places, juxtaposes the mitzvah of kibbud aveim with the observance of Shabbos to communicate a message. All of you and your parents are all obligated to honor me. You are all obligated to observe my command and my word. So, if a parent commands you to violate Shabbos, says the Gemara, do not do so. We noted that the Rambam paskins this way in Mamrim Perek Vav Halacha Yud Beis. Misha Amar, source number 2. Misha Amar lo aviv la'avor al divrei Torah. If a parent commanded you to violate a Torah command, bein she'amar lo la'avor al mitzvahs lo sa'aseh o levatel mitzvahs aseh. Whether they told you violate Shabbos or they told you do not perform a mitzvah saseh. Your parent says forget about tefillin this morning. Tefillin is not so important. Don't put on tefillin. In either circumstance. And then the Rambam adds in bold, and we highlighted this last week, afilu shel divreihem. Even if it is a mitzvah midir rabbanan, it is not a mitzvah midir oraisa. So you have kibbud aveim, which is a mitzvah midir oraisa, one of the Aseret HaDibrot, one of the most important mitzvahs in the Torah, put up against a mitzvah midir rabbanan. The Rambam says you do not listen, you observe the mitzvah, as the Gemara in Yevamos articulates. Why is it that this mitzvah d'Rabbanan beats out the mitzvah d'Oraisa of kibbud aveim? That was our discussion last week. That's the psak of the Rambam. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way as well. Source number 3. Amar lo aviv la'avor al divrei Torah, bein mitzvah saseh, bein mitzvah lo saseh, afilu mitzvah shel divreihem, v'yishmalo. The Shulchan Aruch directly paskins like the Rambam that you should not observe the command in this case. Now, what is the scope of this halacha? So the Rambam gives us some, but the Rambam's cases are kind of pretty clear and direct. Number 1, parent says violate Shabbos. Okay, our parent says eat chazer or basa b'chalav or have a bacon sandwich. Okay, so in that case, you're going to respectfully say no. Parent tells you not to do a mitzvah saseh. Don't eat matzah on Pesach. Don't bench after you eat. Once again, you're going to respectfully say no. I have to do it. Parent tells you to violate a mitzvah b'drabbanan. Don't go to shul to hear the Megillah on Purim. Don't light candles on the nights of Hanukkah. There too, you're going to say no. But what about cases that are more ambiguous, where it's not a parent telling you to violate a Torah command or a parent telling you to not perform a mitzvah, but there's some more gray that's operative in terms of what exactly the Torah demands in the first place. Take a look at the Shulchan Aruch in source number 4. Talmud Torah gadol mi kibbud aveim. The Shulchan Aruch says, learning Torah is greater than kibbud aveim. Now, what exactly does that mean? Talmud Torah gadol mi kibbud aveim, right? That's not a triage case. So what? If your parents told you never learn any Torah, okay, yes, then you'd respectfully say, I have to learn Torah. That's the same as a mitzvah saseh. But that doesn't seem to be entirely what the Shulchan Aruch is articulating. If you look at the Taz in source number 5, the Taz says that this comment of the Shulchan Aruch is based on a Gemara in Maseches Megillah on Daf Tez Zayin. What is it? What does the Gemara in Megillah there say? Source number 5. Talmud Torah gadol. Talmud Torah is greater. Nilmad mi Yaakov. This is learned from. Thank you. This is learned from Yaakov Avinu. How is it learned from Yaakov Avinu? Shene'enash bishvil shelo haya mekayim kibbud aveim b'yosef b'veis Lavan v'al oson yud daled shana shalomar eitzel shem ve'ever lo ne'enash. To unpack what that Gemara Megillah says, the Gemara Megillah there is trying to go through a chronology of Yaakov Avinu's life. It's trying to figure out how you bridge the years between when he left his parents and later when he had children. So what exactly happened? So the Gemara there tells us that, I think it's a well-known medrash, it's certainly entered the canon of early childhood education, that Yaakov spent 20 years in the household of Lavan, but before he did so, where did he stop? He spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem Va'ever. He spent 14 years. Then, of course, everyone asks, what exactly was he learning in the yeshiva of Shem Va'ever? The Torah wasn't given yet. Maybe he was just learning the basic principles of the Torah. I think it was, perhaps, was it Sobolovsky? I don't remember who it was. He said, someone asked him, what did they learn in the yeshiva of Shema Aver? So if you look, they say that they were learning the basics of theology, of monotheism, of the basics of Torah ethics and the like. So someone said Yaakov Avinu was studying that for 14 years. He said, evidently they learned very slowly in the yeshiva of Shema Aver. They spent a long time. Developing those concepts, obviously to their fullest extent, and I'm sure there was, again, immense depth that most of us cannot even begin to penetrate. But Yaakov Avinu spends 14 years in the yeshiva of Shema Aver. The Gemara there says that Yaakov Avinu is actually punished for the time that he spent by Lavan because he wasn't really in touch with his parents, and accordingly he was neglecting the mitzvah of Kibbud Avim. But it's clear from the Gemara that he was not punished for the 14 years that he spent in yeshiva, indicating that while he was fully engrossed in Torah learning, he was exempt from Kibbud Avim. Now, does that mean that you could literally just learn and neglect Kibbud Avim? The Bri Chadash offers an obvious qualification here. He says, source number 6, Talmud Torah gadol mi Kibbud Avim, davka kishetzarech lotzeis meha'ir lomod. When you had to leave the city in order to learn somewhere else, then you are exempt from Kibbud Avim. Yaakov Avinu was no longer home. He had to run. In his case, he had to run because he had to flee Esav. But take a scenario that was quite standard back in Europe. In Europe, the way it worked is you'd learn in the local cheder. You'd learn under the local Rav or the local Mechanech. He would teach you until a point when you had nothing more to learn from him. I mean, most boys would just learn a little bit and then they would go pursue a trade. But the greatest Iluyim in the town, the brightest and most talented young Torah scholars, they would learn until there was nothing more to learn. And then what would they do? They'd send you to the next bigger town to learn under a even more accomplished Talmud Chacham. So in that scenario, says the Bri Chadash, where you have to leave home in order to go somewhere else, then you are exempt from Kibbud Avim. Aval im darim b'ir achas, of course, if you live in proximity to your parents, yichabed es aviv b'yachzor l'saraso, come on, then you're obligated to Kibbud Avim. And you should learn Torah too. The two are not mutually exclusive in that circumstance. And then you are not exempt. But if you are fully engrossed in Torah learning and that requires you to travel far and wide, then you would, in theory, be exempt from Kibbud Avim. Shulchan Aruch offers other potential applications of this idea of the priority of Torah over Kibbud Avim. He says, source number 7, Ima'av rotz el hasharis aben, muter lekabel mimenu el imkena av ben Torah. So he says, first of all, if a father wants to bring food to his child, the child doesn't have to refuse. He's allowed to accept. And then he says in the bold, Talmud sherotz el alechas lamakom. You have a Talmud who wants to go somewhere else to learn. He grew up in Pinsk and he wants to go to Volozhin to learn. He's convinced that that is the yeshiva for me. That is where I will learn best. That's where I will grow as a Ben Torah. That's where I will grow in my Torah knowledge. That is where I will forge my spiritual persona and grow in character. I know that that's where I need to be. But Aviv Mochabo, and the father protests. He's concerned. The child wants to learn in Hebron, not in the yeshiva of Hebron that's in Yerushalayim, in the city of Hebron, and the parents are concerned. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Eino tzarech lishmoa le'aviv bazeh. The child has a right to choose the yeshiva and does not have to observe the word of their parents. Now, of course, I will point out, I'll add my own ha'aros on the Shulchan Aruch, my own footnotes. Of course, the child would be wise to always listen and heed, or at least to consider the advice that their parents are giving him. It's coming from a place of love and concern, and it would be foolish, it would be total folly to totally disregard it. And I'll point out as well, as I always tell my own Talmidim, words of wisdom that I inherited from my own parents. It goes like this. It's 4 words. No pay, no say is the old expression. So yeah, you can insist that that's the yeshiva that you want all you want. You can point to this in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that your parents have to pay for it if they don't support you going there. So those are important just pieces of basic maturity and life maturity that sometimes our young people don't possess. But of course that's obviously true. At the same time, in the event that the child does have the maturity to say, I'm going to pay for it with my own savings, or I'm going to take out student loans, or whatever the case may be, and they insist that that's the place where they want to learn, in principle, they have the right to go there, and there's no obligation of Kibbud Avim to desist from going to that yeshiva where they want to study. The Ramah adds another comment that we're going to delve into a little more next week, but I'll just point it out because it's in this seif, the bottom of line of source number 7. Ein tzarech l'shmoa el ha'av. A child wants to marry a certain girl, and the parents say, no, her parents don't make enough money, so you're not allowed to marry her. The child is allowed to marry that young woman, or the young man is allowed to marry a young woman. The daughter presumably would also be able to marry a young man. Again, it's always important to listen to your parents and heed what they are saying and make sure you're making a wise decision. But in principle, they do not have the authority to deny you that right. So again, that we're not going to get into so much tonight. That's something we will speak about a little bit more next week. I will note, let's just take a look at one more source. Well, before we go into source number 8, the Piskei Tshuva, I heard a story. Rabbi Shai Shafter quoted a story of the Chazon Ish. I don't know if this is in print or not, but it was a really beautiful shaila where he said a shaila came to the Chazon Ish that was the opposite of the scenario described by the Shulchan Aruch. What was the scenario? So evidently a father and son come to the Chazon Ish. So he says, no, what's the shaila? So they said, the child says, my mother, father says, my wife, just had a surgery. Chazon Ish says she should have a refuah shalema. So then they said, here's the machlokas. The son wanted to stay in a local yeshiva so that he could tend to his mother during the recovery period of her surgery. The father wanted his son to grow in learning. So he said, look, I'll take care of your mother. I got it under control. I want you to go to a yeshiva in another place, and I don't want you to be involved in Kibbud Avim. I want you to just focus on your learning. And the shaila that they came to with the Chazon Ish is who wins in that argument in terms of the Kibbud Avim. Again, I thought it was a very beautiful shaila where each was focused on the needs of the other. Chazon Ish paskin like the son. Chazon Ish paskin like the son. He said the entire dispensation of the Shulchan Aruch is a scenario where the child is convinced that they're only going to be able to grow in learning by going elsewhere. But if he wants to learn here, and he thinks he'll be able to learn here, and he's right, it's not so easy to take care of everything, and sometimes you may not be able to take care of everything by yourself. You may need a little bit of assistance from the child. Then he has the right to stay here and perform his mitzvah, Kibbud Avim, to take care of his mother as she's going through this recovery period. So it's beautiful when you have a shiloh like that, but sometimes it doesn't always work in that fashion. And again, in terms of basic principle, the child does have a right to go elsewhere in order to study. Another instance that comes up in the Piskei Tshuva is source number 8. Shuboteach sheyireh. So source number 8 is the Piskei Tshuva commenting on the Shulchan Aruch. And the Piskei Tshuva says, what if we're not dealing with a scenario of a yeshiva to learn, but a shul to daven in? Source number 8. Shuboteach sheyireh. He says that the Sefer Daniel, Chamud Daniel says, he said that, well, first he writes about a case where it's afilu sapik shema yirasim and bracha mutter. Fine, but after the period is the important line for us. The kazav od. Echad, second line, hayarota lehispalo bebeis haknesses, shem hispalo and shem yoser bekavana. Be'imalocha bezeh. Ein tzarich l'shmo Allah. Child wants to go to a shul where he's going to daven with more kavana. And he's motivated by the right reasons. He really wants to daven with kavana, not that's where all the cool kids are hanging out, or the frum kids are hanging out. He really wants to daven better there. Mother says, you get out of shul at 1 p.m. on Shabbos afternoon, it's crazy. So again, maybe he should consider like another shul where they get out a little bit earlier and he can also daven with kavana. But in theory, if the only options are a place where he can daven with kavana and a place where he cannot, he's allowed to choose the place where he can daven with more kavana. So those are areas of tension pertaining to Torah and tefillah. It applies to bein adam lachavero mitzvos as well. Look at source number 9. Source number 9 is a really tragic one. If you just move beyond, I often point out that in the realm of halachic discourse, we're treating all these cases as abstract theoretical scenarios. If you just take a moment to consider what lies underneath them or behind them, sometimes it can be somewhat devastating, and I'd say that's certainly true for source number 9. In source number 9, Piskei Tshuva deals with a case where, just skip to the bold, Im aviv mochesh lo yomar kaddish al ima. So a child is saying kaddish for their mother, and the father says, I don't want you saying kaddish for her. Or vice versa. Can a parent mandate that a child not say kaddish for their second parent? Piskei Tshuva says, no way, Jose. You can't bar your child from saying kaddish for their parent. Whatever objections you may have, you don't have the license to do that. And he says, what is the parent telling the child to violate in that case? You could have said Kibbud Avim, but he goes even further. He says, you know what you're violating? That would be a violation of V'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, not to say Kaddish for one's parent. So that too would be restricted and limited. There are some other interesting qualifications and cases as well. If you look in the Piskei Tshuva in source number 10, here he has an interesting qualification of all these halachos. Again, we could just go through it. This is not a common case, but it is an interesting curiosity. Source number 11 that we'll see together is a very common case. Source number 10. Ein tzarach l'shmo la'aviv. The Piskei Tshuva quotes the Tshuva of the Chavos Yair. Ein b'tshuvos Chavos Yair siman reish yudalid. Shenish'al be'isha shetzivsa b'cholya kodem p'tirasa libna shlo yaskir beisol l'hava l'shum adam. There's a family house, and her tzava on her deathbed, she says to her son, "I don't want you leasing out this house to anyone." V'darbo b'schiros shana zokein talmid chacham u'b'maisa. But already living in this house and kind of expecting to continue living there was a big tzaddik who was learning a lot of Torah and doing a lot of mitzvos and doing a lot of chesed. So the shaila was posed: is he obligated to fulfill his mother's request and throw out this big tzaddik and big talmid chacham who had been staying in the house? And the Chavos Yair goes, he equivocates on this. V'kasav, third line, his first intuition is, you don't really need to worry about it. You don't need to worry about the tzava'ah that the mother said. You don't have to throw out the talmid chacham. Why? After he was, learning Torah intensively, and we just saw that Talmud Torah can trump Kibbud Abe'im. So he says, his first answer is, like we've said before, Talmud Torah can trump Kibbud Abe'im. She can't tell him to do something that's against Torah. Rabbi, Talmud Chacham, Eis Hashem, and then he offers another interesting reason. This is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line of source number 10. He says this Talmud Chacham, because he's so appreciative to the family for providing his lodging for the last year, he wants to learn as a merit for this mother's neshama. And the Chavos Yair says, look, in this world, she thought it was a bad idea to be leasing out the house to a Talmud Chacham. Once she's on the other side and she sees that this Talmud Chacham is learning all this Torah and doing all these mitzvahs as a merit for her, maybe we can assume that she's changed her mind after she made that final journey. That's his initial impulse. But then if you look at the bold, he does a 180-degree flip. He says, in the end of the day, I don't think any of this is sufficient. I don't think any of this would suffice, 3 lines from the bottom, for him to violate this final command of his mother. Etc. I'll unpack all this in a moment. He says, this scenario that we're describing is not really comparable to any of the scenarios discussed in the Gemara or the Rishonim or the Poskim. In the cases that we saw to this point, it's a case where the parents are telling you to violate one of your principles, or alternately to hold back your personal learning in order to fulfill Kibbud Abe'im. Here, the Chavos Yair says, you're still going to be able to keep Shabbos, and you're still going to be able to keep Kashrus, and you're going to do Shabbos Aveda, and you're going to learn in the place where you want to learn, and you're going to daven in the place you want to daven. The command of the mother in this case was limiting someone else's Talmud Torah. Chavos Yair says, obviously we want to promote Talmud Torah in general, especially from a tzaddik and a Talmud Chacham as described in the Tshuva. But he says, your ability, your license or right to not heed the command of a parent is not in order to preserve someone else's Talmud Torah, it's only to preserve your own. And it seems like the conclusion of the Chavos Yair is that they would have to evict this Talmud Chacham because of the command of the mother. A very common question that comes up, which we're not going to delve into fully right now, perhaps we will talk about it a little bit more next week, is a classic shaila posed by Ovadia Yosef in the Tshuvos Yechavadas, Chelak Dalet and Memtaz. Shaila. Mi shehorav garim b'chutz la'aretz. Someone who has parents who live in the diaspora. He lives in Eretz Yisrael, and his parents tell him to move from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. Is he obligated to make Yeridah in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Kibbud Avim? Tshuva, second paragraph of source number 11. Omnam Kibbud Avim mitzvah gedolah. Even though Kibbud Avim is a great mitzvah, that language of mitzvah gedolah comes from the Rambam, who describes Kibbud Avim as a mitzvah gedolah. That's not a language that the Rambam frequently throws around. Nowadays, if somebody says, "Oh, it's a big mitzvah," okay, that flowery language we throw around cavalierly all the time. The Rambam, I assure you, does not throw around that language cavalierly, and yet he describes Kibbud Avim as a mitzvah gedolah, as an exceedingly great mitzvah. Says Rav Ovadia, even though Kibbud Avim is such a great mitzvah, to the point that, as we saw last week, the Gemara Kiddushin compares Kibbud Avim to honoring Hashem Himself. Rav Ovadia says this child does not need to pick up from Petach Tikva and move out to Teaneck or Bergenfield. They are licensed to stay in Eretz Yisrael. He notes that there are some who imply otherwise. In the third paragraph, source number 11, the Amnam B'Shut HaRashbatz Chelak Gimel Kasav, in the Rashbatz, in the third Chelak, he writes, he writes, She'asur Latzeis Me'eretz Yisrael L'Chatz Haaretz, you're not allowed to leave the land of Israel for the diaspora. Elo l'mitzvahs Talmud Torah u'l'mitzvahs Kibbud Avim. He says, however, you are allowed to for Talmud Torah and Kibbud Avim, which would imply that you should leave Israel for Kibbud Avim. But Rav Ovadia says, "Umuvur she'af l'daito she'is mitzvah min haTorah b'yeshivas." I'm sorry. Umuvur she'af l'daito she'is mitzvahs min haTorah b'yeshivas Eretz Yisrael. V'kol makom mitzvahs Kibbud Avim dochem mitzvah zu. He says, the Rashbatz implies that even though there is this illustrious mitzvah of living in the land of Israel, it implies that Kibbud Avim would take priority. But then he qualifies. Ulam regam l'mitzvahs Talmud Torah lo huter lates l'chutz haaretz ela amanas lachzor la'Eretz Yisrael. What is the Rashbatz talking about? A scenario where you're going to take care of a parent for a confined amount of time, and then you are going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. That, he says, you would be obligated to do. But not when your parents are telling you you have to come back for perpetuity. He says it's not clear to him that the Rashbatz would paskin that way. Besikum, he says, last paragraph, source number 11. Mitzvahs yeshiva be'eretz Yisrael ein aruch eleha. You can't place a quantitative value on the mitzvah of yeshiva be'eretz Yisrael. Sheishkula keneged kol mitzvah shebatorah. It is equal to all the mitzvahs in the Torah. There's not Rav Kook writing. This is Rav Ovadia writing. And uvimiyuchad k'she'akavana lehisyashe be'eretz Yisrael l'shem mitzvah l'kayim b'kol mitzvahs t'luyos ba'aretz. Especially when you have religious motivations for living in Eretz Yisrael. It's not just a convenient place to live with nice real estate and views of the Mediterranean, but you're doing so to be there because you want to fulfill all the special mitzvahs that can be done in Eretz Yisrael. He expands it. Not only in a case where a child is in Israel and a parent tells him to come back, he says, if a parent says you're not allowed to make aliyah, then a child is not obligated to listen. He says, strong language. That is the psak of Rav Ovadia. Of course, he concludes, we should all be in Eretz Yisrael and be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Kibbud Avim in Eretz Yisrael. That is Rav Ovadia's psak. I will note two parenthetical points. Number one, there is a minority view that holds against this way. There's a medrash that says that the only reason why Abraham Avinu was allowed to leave his parents in Haran or Kasdim to go to Eretz Canaan was because his father was an Oved Avodah Zarah. But if it weren't for that, then Abraham would not be allowed to leave. So there's one minority view in the Achronim that says, in the event that your parent is not an Oved Avodah Zarah, you would not be allowed to do it. But that certainly is not the mainstream psak. My second qualifier is the obvious. These are quite complicated questions. It's not just a question of tension over mitzvahs when it comes to caring for parents, beyond just the narrow mitzvah of Kibbud Avim and the broader responsibilities that are involved and family sensitivities and the like. There's a whole plethora and multitude of factors that need to be carefully considered. I certainly promote Aliyah and strongly encourage everyone to consider and think about making Aliyah and make Aliyah as well. But when it comes to these kinds of factors, obviously, to state the obvious, there are lots of different factors that need to be thought about very, very carefully. So, in short, you do have a number of these sources that seem to indicate that kibbud av v'em, when it is used as a barrier to spiritual growth, when it is used to stymie spiritual growth, is trumped by other mitzvos and other forms of spiritual pursuit. Now, what do we do in scenarios where this kind of tension does arise? Perhaps not in the direct sense. I don't think anyone, I've never had a case where a young person or a parent comes to me and says, we had a fight as to whether we should do Hashavas Aveda. That's one of the examples in the Gemara. Parent says, finders, keepers, we don't believe in Hashavas Aveda. The child says, I learned in yeshiva or seminary that I should return a lost object, and let's go to the rabbi. I've never had a case like that. But you do have cases, let's say, like the Pre-Shavuot case, where a child wants to daven somewhere else. They don't like the minyan that their parents daven in because it's too loud or too fast, or they're not able to properly focus. What do we do in those scenarios? And here, I want to circle back to what I said at the outset through the prism of two critical sources. Let's start with what advice we give children in this scenario, the advice that I will give children in this scenario. And here, allow me to make reference to Chai Adam that appears in source number 12. This is a favorite source of Rabbi Ari Leibowitz. Whenever he talks about Kibbud av v'em, he quotes this in Chai Adam. Source number 12. Ha-kibbud hu b'machshava hu b'maisa hu b'dibur. Kibbud av v'em exists in thought, in action, and in speech. Now, I will tell you before we go any further, 2 out of those 3 are fairly straightforward and intuitive. Action, you need to take action to honor your parents. Speech, the way you speak to your parents, the way you speak about your parents, needs to be done with proper reverence, respect, honor, etc. What is kibbud av v'em b'machshava? What is the thought process of kibbud av v'em? Says the Chayil. B'machshava. What do I mean when I say that you need to have proper kibbud av v'em in your thoughts? What does that mean? Second line of source number 12. You should never think that your parents are nivzim. How would you translate nivzim? Let's just, in the most generic and sterile sense, they're not worthy of your kavod, and you are just doing so in action because you're commanded to do so. That's the reference to the pasuk in Tehillim. He's dashing the pasuk that you too are nivzeh be'einav. Third line of source 12. Here's the Kri line. After the comment. Your obligation as a child is to view your parents as great. They should be, in your eyes, great people, honored individuals. Even if everybody else thinks that they're just average folk, regular people, you know that they are more than that they are greater than that. And he says, don't think that this idea of machshava is just a nice hashkafic tag-along that I'm giving you to the actual mitzvah of kibbud av v'em. He says, ze ikar kibbud. This is the fundamental center point of kavod. Otherwise, it's just empty actions and empty words. It's not really the true kavod that is due to your parents. I think in areas of tension, and this is a source that we will certainly come back to next week as well, it is critical that one maintains the kibbud av v'em of machshava. All these cases of the Shulchan Aruch, in which there was tension, in which a child is not obligated to heed the command of a parent. I don't know of a single case, I don't think there is a single case, where the Shulchan Aruch would say that you are exempt from this machshava element of kibbud av v'em, that the Chai Adam defines as ikar kibbud. There may be cases where in action, on the level of Maisa, you are not obligated to listen to them, and accordingly, you're not going to be doing kibbud av v'em b'maisa through your actions. But again, I don't think there's any case where you're exempt from this machshava, from this fundamental perspective on one's parents. And I would suggest that precisely in the moments where you are not fulfilling kibbud av v'em b'maisa, precisely in those moments of tension where you are licensed to not heed the command of parents, that component of machshava becomes all the more critical. And to me, that is a fundamental truth that our young people need to internalize, and that I will say, from the perspective of a rabbi and a former educator, that we are not always successful in navigating. I'll tell you two stories about my own experiences as a teacher where I really did try to communicate this message. Number one, so I taught in a school. I taught in a modern Orthodox high school where there certainly was misalignment, to go back to that phrase that I opened with. Like every school has it, and there certainly was, I'd say, an abundance of it. There certainly was a healthy dose of it in our school. And I would always say the following. Whenever I was teaching a halacha class in particular, I said, here is what's going to happen. I am going to teach you the halacha as I best understand it and as I think you should observe it. If you see your parents doing anything wrong, anything that's against what I am teaching you, do not go to your parents and say, the rabbi said you're doing everything wrong. In that scenario, I want you to come to me. Speak to me. First of all, you might be misunderstanding the situation, and they might be doing everything perfectly fine. Second of all, there might be a minority opinion that, again, I wouldn't tell you to rely on ideally, but a minority opinion that perhaps your parents can rely on, and it's not worth creating a stir because they have that opinion to rely on. Number three, if your parents are literally eating cheeseburgers on Yom Kippur, still come to me so that we can talk about how to have that conversation in a respectful way. So it's not just that, oh, the rabbi said you're doing everything wrong and I can't eat in your kitchen anymore. Just having the sensitivity of knowing and understanding, just communicating to our kids that in addition to knowing the halachos of Shabbos, you need to be sensitive to the halachos of Kibbud Avayim when there is tension between the two. Even if it's an instance where Shabbos is going to take priority, like all these cases that we described in the Shulchan Aruch, simply knowing that doesn't mean that the Shulchan Aruch, your Deyasim and Reish Mem, all the halachos of Kibbud Avayim fly out the window, and that those halachos do still apply precisely in those moments of tension, to me, was a core lesson, a critical lesson that I wanted my students to understand. Again, even in, and perhaps precisely in, scenarios where the more outward forms of Kibbud Avayim would not necessarily apply. Number two, I'll tell you another story that was, again, not quite as acute a form of tension, but a significant one. I had a student whose parents did not want her to go to seminary for the year. She really very badly wanted to study in seminary in Eretz Yisrael. She was yearning for spiritual growth, and her parents weren't letting her go. So we spoke about it for a while, and I had a close relationship with the student and a little bit of a relationship with the family as well. And I said to her the following. I said, I know your parents a little bit, and I'm very, very confident that they are not against you going, learning, growing, etc. What your parents are afraid of is losing you, that you are going to go somewhere else, reject them, become a different person that doesn't really is not still rooted or anchored to the home that you grew up in. That is their fear. And I said to her, what you need to understand is the following. You're probably not going to spend your life doing exactly the same thing as your parents. Again, she wasn't from a fully Shomer Shabbos home, a partially Shomer Shabbos home. You're not going to do things the exact same way as your parents. And you're going to grow, and you're going to learn new things, and you're going to take new things on. Your home will look different from the home that you grew up in. But you need to understand, I said to her, that whatever you build in your life, spiritually, morally, ethically, whatever you build in terms of your family, all of it is built on the foundation that your parents gave you. And yes, you are going to do things differently, because you know what? That's what happens with kids. Our kids are not carbon copies of us. They do things in their own way. They go in a slightly different direction. But you need to understand that no matter what, it is always built on that foundation. Do not become one of those kids that spend a year in seminary or yeshiva, whatever the case may be, and then think that they're rejecting everything they learned to that point because they're born again and now they have this new reality. That is a grave misperception, a failure of Kibbud Avayim, a failure of Akar Satov. And it's wrong on many, many levels. As you take on new things, always remember that it is built on the foundation that your parents gave you. And I said to her, once you understand that, make sure that your parents understand that you understand that. Once you know that, make sure your parents know that you know that. In her case, again, not all stories have fairy tale endings like this, but she went home that night, she had a conversation with her parents, and the next day she was signed up to go to seminary. It doesn't always, again, end that way, but it was just a reframing of the issue so that she understood the machshava of Kibbud Avayim, even in instances of tension. And I think for us as children, precisely, as I said before, precisely in those instances of tension, we need to double down on the machshava component of kibbud avim, make sure it is always present, and that should be the baseline from which we operate, even in instances when it is not going to carry over to Maisa and Dibur. And what do we do as adults when we face these kinds of scenarios where we want one thing for our children and they want something else? I'll share with you a story. It's a story about Rabbi and his son, Rav Yitzi Lechenstein, who's currently the Rosh Yeshiva of Jar B'das. Story goes, I don't know all the details, but story goes that Rav Yitzi went to learn in America, the opposite of what we do. We go to learn in Eretz Yisrael. They were living in Eretz Yisrael. He went to learn by his grandfather, Rav Soloveitchik, in New York. And he picked up certain chumras while he was in New York. I don't even know what the chumras were. And he came back to his parents and said, look, I have these chumras regarding kashrus, I don't know if I can even the kitchen. Now, if ever in history there was a scenario where a parent would be justified in slapping their child across the face and saying, what are you, nuts? Have you totally lost your mind? It probably would have been this situation. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. Rav Lechenstein saw that his son was sincere, and he and Rebbetzin Dr. Tova Lechenstein kashered their kitchen to make sure that their son's chumras were attended to. Now, I'm not saying that that is an easy thing to do, but it's a remarkable paradigm. It's a remarkable paradigm. When a child comes back, and here I'm going to borrow from my brother. When a child comes back and says, I think this is wrong or that's wrong, of course, the child should do so in the right way. That goes back to part number one, and often they don't. And that can be very, very difficult. But we have a choice in that moment. Either we can get very defensive and recoil and say, this is not how we do things, and yell and scream, etc. Or we can say, you know what? Let's ask a rabbi. Let's ask our rabbi and see what he says. I hear that your Rebbe in Yeshiva said X. We have so much respect for your Rebbe in Yeshiva. He's not our posek. Let's ask our posek what the psak is. When you do that, two things are going to happen. First, in 85% of cases, you're going to be right, and the Rebbe in Yeshiva was probably wrong. Either because I'm not saying the Rebbe Yeshiva was wrong, or because your child misinterpreted the scenario or misapplied what the Rebbe exactly told them. In almost all circumstances, it's not going to be exactly the same, and it's quite likely that the Rav is going to tell you that, yeah, what you're doing is perfectly fine. Number two, even when that's the case, you have made a statement to your child. You have said, we are a family that values Torah, that values halacha, that wants to do things the right way. And if you're giving us this feedback, we're going to go to Rav, and we're going to make sure that we are pursuing things the right way. When the Piskei Tshuva talks about a child who wants to daven in a different minyan, that could be a hard thing to hear. But maybe one of our questions should be, is our shul really a place that's living up to the standards of tefillah that we aspire for, that we want our children to reach for, to hope for? And yes, partially the response might be, help us get there. That's sometimes my response to these young men and women who come back from yeshiva. Davka, go back to our shuls and our minyanim and elevate and help us reach the levels that we want to reach. But I think part of our response should be looking in the mirror and saying, are we indeed reaching the heights that we want to reach and that we want our children to reach? I often point out that the most natural parental instinct is to want our kids to be better than we are. We always want them to strive higher, to reach greater heights in every form of life, in profound things. We want them to be healthier, have greater mental health and emotional health. We want them to go to better schools and have better jobs. And even when it comes to the most trivial things, we want them to have a higher score in bowling and a better mid-range jump shot and all those things. Our natural parental impulse is we want our children to go higher than we have ever reached, and we want them to outpace us and to do better than we are. And sometimes we forget that in like the most important area of our lives. When it comes to Torah and mitzvos and moral values and spiritual pursuits, somehow there we have this, I don't know, I can't really explain it, but sometimes in that area we recoil instead of celebrating the growth that our children exhibit. And as parents, we should encourage and we should celebrate. And yes, sometimes it's hard, particularly in moments of tension, but just like our children, and that's the primary obligation, need to remember the machshava of kibbud avim, I think we are better serving both them and ourselves if we try to maintain a healthy perspective as well. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in source number 13, we won't read it inside because we do need to end in a moment for Marav. But the Kibbud Shulchan Aruch says, you know what the greatest form of Kibbud Av V'Em is? The greatest form of Kibbud Av V'Em is when you live life like a mensch and a ben Torah and a good person, a person who's kind and compassionate and honest and diligent and all of those things. And people can then go back to your parents and say, wow, what a child you have raised. The Kibbud Shulchan Aruch says that is the greatest form of Kibbud Av V'Em. Sometimes the irony is we ourselves, at least in the moment, lose sight of that. On the path to reaching that point, when everyone is going to tell us how wonderful our kids are and how kind and compassionate and generous and all those other midos that the Torah instructs us to live by, on the process of getting there, sometimes we lose sight of that Kibbud Av V'Em and we get caught in the thicket of which yeshiva to go to or which minyan to daven in, and those features. We don't allow ourselves to reach that greatest point of Kibbud Av V'Em, receiving that greatest Kibbud Av V'Em of the nachas that our children can provide. To me, the answer to misalignment is not trying to bridge the gap. Again, we should, and in areas perhaps we can. To me, it's much more important to reframe the misalignment, to make sure that our kids know that their parents gave them everything, love them more than anything in the world, would give anything for them. And even when things are different, it's never, God forbid, a rejection of parents, but the machshava of Kibbud Av V'Em always needs to be there. Period. End of story, 100% of the time. That is piece number one. And from a parental standpoint, to recognize that when our children are different, it's not always coming from a lack of Kibbud Av V'Em. Sometimes it's actually in pursuit, at least by the Kibbud Shulchan Aruch standpoint, of the greatest form of Kibbud Av V'Em, giving us the nachas of knowing that our children live by the Torah and its values and the spiritual principles that we hold dear. May we all be zocha to that form of Kibbud Av V'Em, and may the areas of tension along the way be minimal and non-existent. May we all ultimately reach the full expression of Kibbud Av V'Em. It's greatest.